Hey guys, at the break of dawn in ancient Rome, 6 women dressed in white moved silently through a circular temple. They were called the purest souls in the empire, virgins chosen by the goddess herself. But when one of them was accused of breaking her vow, what the priest did next wasn't execution. It was something far more terrifying. They sealed her alive in an underground chamber, gave her a loaf of bread and a lamp, then buried her while Rome cheered above. This is the story of the Vestal Virgins, the most honored and most imprisoned women in history, whose sanctity was less a blessing and more a lifetime sentence that could end in unimaginable horror. Before we descend into that darkness, hit that like button. If you've ever felt trapped by expectations you didn't choose, subscribe. Because what happened to these women reveals truths about power and control that echo through history to today. Comment below. Would you have accepted this so-called honor? What you're about to hear is documented in the writings of Cicero, Livy, and Plutarch, verified by archaeological excavations in 1883, and has been misunderstood as religious devotion when it was actually systemic imprisonment disguised as divine service. Across the breadth of the Roman Forum, where marble columns reached toward the heavens and senators debated the fate of empires, stood a temple unlike any other. The Temple of Vesta was small, circular, and contained no golden statues or jeweled treasures. Inside burned a single flame, eternal, sacred, untouchable. The Romans believed that if this fire ever died, the city itself would fall. Its armies would crumble, its gods would abandon it. Everything Rome had built since the days of Romulus would turn to ash. And so, around that flame moved 6 women whose entire existence was defined by a single purpose: keep the fire burning, no matter the cost to their own lives. These were the Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. They wore white robes that fell like mist around their pale faces. They moved through Rome with an otherworldly grace, and citizens bowed their heads as they passed. Senators rose when they entered a room. They sat in the front rows at the games. They could pardon a condemned criminal simply by touching him. They owned property, drafted wills, and lived in a grand villa called the Atrium Vesti, adorned with fountains and marble mosaics. By all appearances, they were the most privileged women in Rome. But beneath that veneer of honor lay a reality far darker. These women weren't chosen, they were taken. Between the ages of 6 and 10, girls from noble families were presented before the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome. The children stood trembling in white tunics while priests studied their faces, their posture, even the steadiness of their eyes. Physical perfection was required, no deformities, no blemishes. When one was chosen, her mother wept, her father bowed, and the child was led away, forbidden ever to embrace her parents again. She was no longer their daughter, she belonged to the goddess. The ritual that followed was deceptively gentle. The child's hair was cut, a lock burned in the sacred fire. Her name was changed, her past erased. Then came the vow, spoken before the gods and the gathered priests: I will remain pure in body and spirit for 30 years. 30 years. 10 years learning the rituals, 10 years tending the flame, 10 years teaching the next generation. Only then, at nearly 40 years old, could she leave, if she lived that long. Few ever married afterward. Freedom felt foreign after a lifetime of obedience. Every morning before Rome stirred, the Vestals rose to feed the sacred fire. The eldest, called the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, whispered prayers as flames hissed and crackled. If the fire dies, Rome dies with it. It was no poetic exaggeration. The people genuinely believed their empire's destiny was tied to these women's devotion. And so the Vestals became living symbols, not of their own humanity, but of Rome's purity. To maintain that illusion, their lives were stripped of everything that made them human. Love was forbidden. Marriage was forbidden. Even sexual desire was forbidden. They were expected to be perfect, divine, untouchable. Not women, but icons. But icons cannot bleed. And these women bled. Little did they know, the same priests who granted them privileges also held the power to destroy them. The Pontifex Maximus supervised every aspect of their lives. He alone interpreted the will of the goddess. He alone judged whether a Vestal had remained pure. And he alone could sentence her to the most horrifying punishment Roman law allowed. To Rome, purity wasn't just a virtue, it was policy. The empire's stability, its military victories, its prosperity, all were believed to flow from the chastity of these 6 women. When drought struck, when plague spread, when lightning burned a temple, the blame fell not on the Senate or the emperor, but on the women who guarded the flame. A single rumor of impurity could ignite mass hysteria. If you're already disturbed by what you're hearing, wait until you discover how they tested these women's purity. Hit that like button now, because what comes next reveals the cruelty hiding behind religious devotion. When a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, whether through actual transgression or mere suspicion, she could not defend herself in a public trial. Her judges were the same priests who claimed divine authority. The proceedings were swift, the verdict often predetermined. And if she was found guilty, Roman law dictated a punishment that was bloodless in technique, but absolute in horror. Because a Vestal was considered sacred, her blood could not be spilled. So the priests devised something worse. Near the city walls lay a place called the campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked. There they prepared a small underground chamber, barely larger than a tomb. Inside they placed a couch, a small oil lamp, a loaf of bread, and a jug containing milk and water. Enough, they claimed, to preserve the illusion that she wasn't being murdered, but merely left to the will of the gods. On the day of execution, the condemned Vestal was dressed in her ceremonial robes. Her veil was drawn low over her face. The entire city fell silent as she was led through the streets in a funeral procession for the living. Some followed out of pity. Most followed out of fear. To them, her death meant Rome's sins were being cleansed. The Pontifex Maximus recited prayers. Her hands were bound. Then she was lowered down a narrow stairway into the earth. Picture her final moments, the darkness closing in. The sound of timber being laid over the opening above, the scrape of earth and stone sealing her fate. The crowd above erupting in cheers, celebrating Rome's renewed purity. And below, in that suffocating blackness, the lamp flickering weakly as oxygen slowly ran out, the bread untouched, the milk undrunk, the goddess silent. She would die slowly, hours, perhaps days, entombed alive while Rome went about its daily business overhead. What was meant to be divine justice became psychological torture, buried not for what she had done, but for what Rome needed to believe about itself. History remembers the case of Cornelia, the Virgo Vestalis Maxima during Emperor Domitian's reign in 83 CE. She had served 20 years without fault. Her devotion was beyond question. Then came a season of calamity. Thunder split the Capitoline Hill. Plague spread through the streets. Lightning struck the temple of Jupiter itself. The people murmured. The priest grew restless. Domitian, desperate to appear decisive, demanded a reason. Superstition provided an easy answer. All eyes turned to Cornelia. She was accused of breaking her vow of chastity. There was no witness, no confession, no evidence. Only the emperor's need to blame someone and the priest's willingness to provide a scapegoat. The trial was theater disguised as justice. When Cornelia stood before her accusers, her face was pale but defiant. "I am innocent," she said softly, "and Vesta knows it." But Domitian's eyes were cold. He had already decided her fate. The verdict was read in silence. Guilty. That night, torchlight filled the streets. Cornelia was led through crowds who averted their eyes, not from respect, but from fear. No one dared speak for her. The procession wound toward the campus celeratus. When they reached the chamber, Cornelia stumbled on the stairs. A priest reached to steady her, but she recoiled, whispering a curse that history did not record. They sealed the opening with timber and clay, then piled earth upon it until the mound was smooth. When it was over, the Pontifex Maximus raised his hands to the heavens and proclaimed, "Rome is purified." The crowd cheered, and in the darkness below, Cornelia's lamp burned until it didn't. But Cornelia's story was not unique. Centuries earlier, a Vestal named Emilia was condemned when the sacred fire went out during her watch. She insisted it was an accident, divine will, not neglect. Her words meant nothing. The Pontifex declared her lapse had offended the gods. She was buried alive. Another Vestal, Licinia, was accused by Crassus, one of Rome's richest men. His true motive: he coveted her land, a villa she had legally inherited. By branding her impure, he could seize it. Public outrage eventually forced him to withdraw. But Licinia lived the rest of her life under suspicion, her reputation destroyed. The pattern was always the same. Misfortune struck Rome, an accusation followed, a Vestal paid the price. For every failed harvest, every bad omen, every military defeat, a priestess became the sacrifice. Rome could not bear to admit that its gods were indifferent, so it made its priestesses scream instead. Behind the veil of faith lurked something even darker: control. Ancient writers, cautious but bold in their suggestions, hint at tests of virtue performed by the priests. These ritual verifications were invasive, humiliating, and cloaked in sacred pretense. No man outside the priesthood could touch a Vestal, but the Pontifex Maximus could summon her in private, claiming to ensure her purity. It was the perfect system of domination, absolute authority disguised as piety. For the women inside the temple, there was no appeal, no escape. A smile at a festival, a glance exchanged with a messenger, a word misinterpreted, all could be twisted into accusations of impurity. To be a Vestal was to live in a gilded cage, worshipped as divine, yet treated as expendable. If this story is making your blood boil, leave a comment about what you'd say to those priests if you could travel back in time. And subscribe, because understanding how power weaponizes purity is more relevant today than you might think. Time moves strangely in the heart of empires. By the 4th century CE, Rome had grown too vast, too fractured. Its gods were no longer feared, only remembered, and the sacred flame that had burned for nearly 1,000 years began to sputter in the shadow of something new: Christianity. Emperor Constantine's conversion marked the beginning of the end. The cross replaced the eagle. The Christian god replaced Jupiter and Vesta. The temple still stood, but visitors came out of curiosity, not devotion. The atrium vesti began to empty. The rituals grew quieter, the offerings fewer. Still, the last generation of Vestals clung to their vows. They had given their lives to the goddess. To abandon her now would mean everything they'd endured. The isolation, the fear, the sacrifices had been for nothing. But history is never merciful to those who refuse to move with it. In 394 CA, Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree. All pagan practices were abolished. Temples were to be closed, sacrifices outlawed, and the sacred flame of Vesta was to be extinguished forever. The day it happened, the sky over Rome was gray. The last 6 Vestals gathered in silence inside their temple. They stood before the altar, their white robes dulled with age, their faces lined with years of devotion. No crowd came to watch. No priests performed rites. Only the distant tolling of church bells echoed from the hills. One by one they stepped forward. They knelt before the flame that had outlived kings, emperors, and gods. Their hands trembled as they poured the final oil and whispered the final prayers. The fire flickered weakly, then died. The silence that followed was heavier than any death sentence. For centuries, Romans had believed that if the flame went out, the city would perish. And in a sense, they were right. That moment marked not just the end of a ritual, but the end of Rome as it had known itself. The temple was sealed. The atrium vesti fell into ruin. The names of the last priestesses were never recorded. Their graves, if they had any, were lost to time. In 1883, archaeologist Rodolfo Lanciani excavated the atrium vesti. Beneath layers of soil and shattered marble, his team found fragments of statues, oil lamps, and jewelry. But what haunted them most were the human traces, footprints etched into stone floors, worn thresholds where countless feet had passed. The space still carried a strange stillness, as if time itself paused. There among the ruins they found inscribed plaques honoring Vestals by name: Flavia Publicia, Caelia Claudiana, Terentia Flavola. Women who had lived, served, and died in service to a flame that no longer existed. Modern historians now understand that the Vestal virgins represented Rome's deepest anxieties about female power and sexuality. By controlling these women's bodies, Rome symbolically controlled its own destiny. The priestesses weren't guardians of purity. They were insurance policies, living offerings kept alive only until the gods supposedly demanded otherwise. The tragedy wasn't just that innocent women were punished for crimes they didn't commit. It was that they were forced to live as symbols of a purity no human being could sustain. Every moment was a performance. Every breath was measured. And when they faltered, even slightly, the very men who claimed to worship them became their executioners. This story teaches us that beneath every empire's greatness lies the quiet cost of those who were silenced to maintain its illusion. It reminds us that purity enforced by power isn't holiness. It's cruelty disguised as worship. And it shows us that even in the darkest chambers of history, truth endures longer than any empire. So, a simple vow of chastity became a lifetime of psychological imprisonment. A rumor of impurity became a death sentence worse than any execution. 6 women at a time spent their lives guarding a flame that symbolized Rome's power, while Rome itself consumed them. If this story left you shaken, Subscribe for more hidden histories that reveal uncomfortable truths about how power operates. Hit that bell because next time, we're investigating the Byzantine empress who was buried alive in a convent by her own son, where beauty became a curse and mercy was delivered through poison. Tell us in the comments what unsettled you most about the Vestal's fate. Until then, remember, history's darkest secrets are often hidden in plain sight, dressed in white robes and called sacred.